Welcome to Get Smarter! I am Christy Winters, and in today's episode I'd like to review a talk given by Bart Ehrman on his book, Jesus Interrupted. The main thrust of the talk is Bart Ehrman's exploration of the notions of authenticity and forgery in Christian writings in the early centuries of the Christian movement. In terms of an overview of the video itself, there's an introduction that goes from the start until about minute 4. The lecture itself takes place from about minute 4 to about minute 31. Then there is a Q&A section from that minute 31 all the way until the end, which is 1 hour and 4 minutes long in total. In the Q&A section, some of the questions that come up, just to let you know in case you want to go ahead and watch that, is the question, did Jesus exist? Do historians think Jesus was an historical figure? The Gospel of Judas and Bart Ehrman's views on the importance of the Gospel of Judas. Do religious writings have meaning for a non-believer is one of the questions he answered. And also he, in that discussion, reviews his own first paradigm shift when it came to his deconversion from Christianity into, I think he calls himself now, an agnostic atheist. So there's a lot of interesting things, not just the issue of authenticity and forgery, although that is the main topic and the theme that runs throughout. In terms of the camera work, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5 stars. It's generally pretty good, but the person does sometimes try to zoom in and zoom out in a way that's distracting. So I couldn't give it a 5 out of that. The audio, though, is very good, and so you can definitely hear everything he says, and it's a very clear, well-produced audio quality on that. The main thrust of Ehrman's lecture points deals with the idea that forgery was something that was ubiquitous in the ancient world, that people were aware that forgeries exist and they had a very low opinion of forgers, just as we do today. And he also dispels some myths about the notion that people would use scribes to write the letters, and that somehow this was a practice of the ancient world. He can find no evidence that this was a practice. It's something that theologists and seminary students are taught, and they themselves pass it along. But there's really no evidence to support that idea. Another myth that he destroys has to do with the idea that it was not unusual in philosophical schools to write something and then put the name of your instructor on it in order to give credit. So the one instance of this throughout the ancient world that he found was someone writing much later who attributed this practice to people who followed Pythagoras. But in fact, when we look at the writings of the followers of Pythagoras, they don't do this. So then the notion that someone could write in somebody else's name and have that accepted is debunked, and the notion that scribes were used to write letters. For instance, if Peter was an illiterate fisherman, he would have somebody who was proficient in Greek to help him write out these letters and then put Peter's name on it. This practice just has no historical basis. So what did happen in the ancient world? Well, there were forgers, and people knew that there were forgers, and they had a very low opinion of them. Ehrman's lecture is organized in a very beautiful and elegant way. He continues to use Peter, the disciple Peter, and the character of Peter as touchstones as he moves through periods of time. So first he looks at books outside the canon that were attributed to Peter, and he reviews some of the ways in which claims of authenticity were made by attributing it to historical figures like Peter, and what those books outside the gospel contain. And as he then moves into the New Testament itself, he looks at the known sort of disputed letters of Paul that he calls forgeries, and other anonymous letters such as Hebrews that were accepted because they were assumed to be authentic, and also the anonymous works of the Gospels. So he divides the New Testament up into the accepted and undisputed letters of Paul. Then there are a bunch of anonymous works that include the Gospels, and then there are, in Revelation, I believe we know it's a John, but we don't know who the John is, or who that John is, so it's kind of an anonymous author. And then finally you have documents that are forged, and that is pretty much what the talk is focused on. In his discussion of books outside the canon, he discusses the Gospel of Peter and the Apocalypse of Peter, and he uses other examples too, but that's a nice way to keep bringing it back to a character that we know. And then inside the New Testament, he looks at 1 Peter and 2 Peter and makes the case that because Acts describes Peter as illiterate, the word literally translates into unlettered. He's not able to form letters or read letters. Peter was unlettered, and given that he was a fisherman who spoke Aramaic, who was never educated, the idea that somehow, even over the course of his life, he could have mastered the high level of Greek, the rhetoric, the stylistic points that are necessary to write 1 Peter and 2 Peter just is not particularly plausible to him. He doesn't think that there's anything in there that justifies a link back to an historical Peter. And that's pretty much the focus of his talk, is to really examine what can we say about who wrote these texts, and also not only what can we say about the person who's writing them, but perhaps even more importantly, what are their motivations? What is their theology? What are they trying to communicate to their audience? What are they trying to convince people of? And so if you have not done a whole lot in terms of biblical scholarship, if this is a new field for you or you're just starting out, then I would highly recommend this video as being a really good evidence-based discussion that includes historical method standards for what constitutes evidence, why it constitutes evidence, and then what kinds of claims we can make within a margin of error, within a term of probability, within a range of probability. What is the more likely or the less likely thing to have happened? Is it more likely that an unlettered fisherman from the Galilee would suddenly spend his time learning Greek letters for decades and decades and rhetoric in order to write a couple letters? Or is it more likely that one of his followers, or a later convert who had already obtained these skills, wrote in Peter's name in order to advance a theological point? And Ehrman and I would side on the side of it being more likely someone who already knew all those things and had all those skills would write that. And so that's basically what the talk is about. If you like this video, I will also put into the description box below a link to a more recent interview that Bart Ehrman did on NPR on his book, Did Jesus Exist? And I am hoping on my channel in 2015 at some point to go over Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? And give the reasons why I end up on the historical Jesus side, all of the evidence and the theories and the method that brought me to conclude that it's more likely that an historical Jesus exists. I find that more plausible than to look at the evidence and look at what we need theory to do and say that this was purely mythical. But that's a preview for my channel later on. I hope you've enjoyed this review. Please check out both his Bart Ehrman's talk at the Commonwealth group, and if you are interested, go ahead and click on the link to Did Jesus Exist? It is, like I said, that's about a 20-minute National Public Radio interview, and very well done. So go ahead and enjoy, and I'll see you guys next time on Get Smarter.